she founded Empower Now, an attempt at bridging the skill gap in corporate India. At Ahmedabad University, her job is she introduces new pedagogy, new courses, and she also is an avid reader. I personally know that. So thank you, Juhi, for doing this. Before I hand it over to you, there are certain rules, as we know, except both the guests today, everybody will be muted. And during that time, you can put your questions in everybody's chat box. We'll take all these questions and come back to you at the end of the conversation, let's say somewhere around 7:30, 7:20, 25. No, I think 7:05 or 7:10. That's all from my side. And if you're joining from a device which is not named and which tells about your mobile name, please rename yourself. That will help us to call you during the question and answer. So thank you so much. And I request Juhi to take it forward.
Thank you so much, Sudhir. Thank you for the introduction. Hi, Vivan. Welcome to Ahmedabad University. And welcome to the conversation series.
Thank you. Looking forward to doing this. I wish we could have done it in person, but
I know
it's I'm many thousands of miles away, but still looking forward to this
yeah,
this
so whenever
discussion.
you're next here in India, we should
Yes,
come to Ahmedabad. Yeah.
absolutely.
Okay. So, Vivan, for the ease of discussion, I will structure the conversation in two parts. We will begin by discussing your book, the research around it, and more importantly, what millennials want. And the second part of the conversation will focus on post-millennials, since a lot of issues that you bring out in your book ring true even for this generation. Okay, so you describe, and millennials are described as people born between 1981 to 1996. So basically anyone who's currently between 25 to 40 years of age. This includes most of our faculty and staff. There are about 440 million millennials in India, which means we theoretically have so many people adding to our employment numbers. However, you mention in your book that instead of it being a demographic dividend, it is actually a demographic crisis. Would you throw some light on it?
Absolutely. So just, before we start off, as we just mentioned, millennials are people born between 1981 and 1996. And this is, usually a marketing term. In the marketing sector, we like to divide, or we like to, for our purposes, break down generations in different age brackets so that we can market products and services more effectively to them. But one of the reasons why studying millennials, particularly Indian millennials, is so important is simply because of the number. The people born between 1981 and 1996 in India are nearly 400 to 440 million. That's more than the population of many countries and sometimes even continents combined. That's more than the population of the United States and Canada combined. And so the reason why it's really important to really understand Indian millennials is because this is a group of voters, but they're also a group of consumers, they're also a group of users, and they're just a group of citizens. And understanding the aspirations and understanding the anxieties of this generation will really help us understand the future of India and how we can all contribute positively to that future. Now, 10, 15 years ago, youth, and this large number of millennials was called India's demographic dividend. And the belief was that if we invest in the potential of this youth, and if this youth has very high paying jobs, they are able to spend money, they're able to purchase goods and services, and then they pay taxes, and that money goes back into the economy, and it essentially creates a dividend, or an economic dividend, where new industries, new sectors are being created, and prosperity is flowing for everyone. And so that was the belief 10, 15 years ago, that India's youth would actually be one of its positive qualities, when contributing to the economy. But unfortunately, what's happening today is that the youth is seeing some of its highest unemployment numbers. And when you go out to small town India, you're still seeing youth engaged in these odd jobs and informal jobs where they're not really able to, make a lot of money and consume those goods and services or contribute to the economy and society the way we expect youth in India to contribute, or the way we expected them to contribute 10 or 15 years ago. And so we are actually at a stage where, in other countries, when the youth is employed, they're paying taxes, and that tax money is used to fund services for older generations. But in India today, we're at this, funny stage where political parties are actually creating welfare programs for the youth, which is kind of, counterintuitive. And it's kind of, the opposite of what we should be doing, because the youth is, the one that funds the social programs for everyone else. But just the high rate of unemployment and the lack of, economic opportunities or stable, I should say, stable economic opportunities in small town India is really creating a big, demographic crisis that you're seeing with some of the job riots, that you're seeing with the fact that, every time a new government position opens up, you have thousands, if not millions of people applying for them. And you're just seeing in, the broader social strife, the response to the Agnipath scheme, the response to, any program that sometimes changes government recruitment, the way so many people agitate, just shows that we haven't succeeded in creating those private sector stable jobs that would otherwise have the youth employed.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, I remember one part in your book where you've given data on how even for the position of a peon, PhDs are applying. And I was just joking with one of our faculty members, and he was like, "Oh my God, is that yeah?" So it's sort of scary in a way. Okay. Vivan, you've traveled through the length and breadth of the city of the country, researching for your book. Did you see any difference, in the aspirations or in the thought process of the millennials across economic backgrounds and across geographical locations as well?
No, one of the things that I found is that in many ways in today's, India, the internet and social media have sort of kind of dissolved that big city, small town gap, and that people in small towns, have the same access to information and aspiration as people in big cities do. So the number of people who I met in big cities who were studying for the UPSC was very similar to the number of people I met in small towns. And earlier you had mentioned one of the data points I shared in my book about millions of people applying for a peon jobs, peon level job. And the thing is, like, why is that? And that's what I dive into in my book, is that at the end of the day, when there's no stable job in the private sector, that young people see that, oh, this is a job that will pay me good money and that I'll be able to, rely on. The only jobs like that exist are within the government. So you come into the situation where you have people with PhDs, you have people with MBA degrees and with advanced engineering degrees, and no matter the quality of those actual degrees, but the fact that people with those degrees, and thousands, if not millions of them are applying for these jobs, is because, there is no other stable job. And so going to your question, even in big cities, like a lot of people, yes, like, I actually have a lot of, I'm one of the people who does not, who looks at Zomato, Swiggy very favorably because they've created jobs where none existed earlier. But I still have not met anyone, and I write this in my book, who aspires to be an Uber driver or someone who aspires to be a Zomato driver. They do it because it helps them make ends meet, but not because that's a job they really want to be doing. And the fact is that, regardless of where you are in India, unless you come from like a certain section of society where you can, get a job at a, fancy glass building in Gurgaon or, BKC in Mumbai, you don't really know that is in your in your destiny. And so for everyone else, it's like, ha, hame to sarkari naukri chahiye, because there's nothing else that is really a job that will help them get stability. And then I also met a lot of people who knew they weren't going to get a government job, and they just felt like that's never going to happen for us. So they were just sort of all engaged in like these petty jobs. And you see this in big cities as well, where you'll see a lot of young men at the middle of the working day, just hanging around outside. And they either they're not engaged in productive economic activity, or they are all kind of doing odd jobs here and there, trying to make ends meet. And that's something you see in small town India as well.
And again, I remember a part of your, there's a specific part in the book where, someone is saying that, even the pakode wala, that's sort of an employment. And, then you feel bad because that's not what a millennial is looking for, right? Of course, like you said, we have to make ends meet. So we will take whatever work comes our way. But yeah, we're looking for better employment opportunities. Yeah. So Vivan, I know that your research is around Indian millennials, but I'm sure you come across millennials from other countries as well, especially the US, because you're based there. Do you see a vast difference between an American millennial and an Indian millennial?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I don't think comparing, um, you know, uh, millennials from one country to the other is always the most, interesting question. But in this case, I think it is, because, you know, these two countries are, India is the biggest country, I mean, second largest country in the world, and America is the third. But millennials, between India and the US, and even India and China, are very different. And the reason why I say that is not because of social views or anything like that. It's because of economic aspirations. Is that if you come to the US and you ask, if you do a survey of millennials over here, like, would you want a government job? I mean, people would probably laugh in your face. Like, what does that mean? Like, why would I want to work for the government? There's a very big skepticism of the government. And particularly if you ask people with MBAs or PhDs, like, would you apply for like a peon or like the lowest level job in the government? Like, you would be laughed out of the room. Meanwhile, like 6 in 10 of Indian millennials list a government job as their top priority, as their number one choice of employment. And it's actually more than 6 in 10, it's 64%. And so the just fundamentally, that is like the biggest difference. And the way that manifests itself and the way that plays out is the different purchasing power and economic power of millennials in India and the US, naturally, but also India and China. And the reason why I'm bringing China into this is because uh, uh, about 5-6 decades ago, the countries were not that different in terms of where they stood economically. And today, like, Chinese millennials, this is one of the poll questions. Today, Chinese millennials are far more financially secure and, economically secure than, young people in India are. And so I think the big difference, that you see is the economic security. And then because of the lack of economic security, people want different jobs. And because of the lack of economic security, it also affects everything else that people do in their lives. And you see that, with things like marriage, you see that with, just, general, the way people behave and the way they spend their money and spend their time.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the American dream still exists and the Indian dream is way far behind.
Yeah, I don't know about, I mean, I don't know if, I think America is the only country that has the dream associated with it. But it's a very interesting question to look at how young people in, different countries. And now there's a lot of survey work and all that's also being done on this, because as the world becomes increasingly more connected, how do tech companies and how do other companies sell their products to different people across the world differently. And it still is that India will give you lots of users for your products, but not necessarily a lot of revenue. And I mean, that's like, I know it's a completely separate topic of discussion altogether, but it's, really interesting to see how people behave differently around the world.
Yeah. Vivan, most of the research in your book was done pre-COVID, and and I think during COVID and post-COVID, life as we know it has changed completely for most of us. So, do you think have you had a chance to revisit some of the conclusions in your book, and do you think they still stand true, or is there things around the gig economy or even education? So much has changed over the last 2-3 years.
Yeah, one of the things is that most of my research was done before COVID, but I continued to talk to the people, during COVID and even after. One of the things that really struck me is how COVID, in many terms, has been a middle, upper middle, and wealthy persons, middle class, upper middle class, and wealthy persons, problem in India, more than it's really affected the working class, which is a majority of the country. And what I mean by that is that, if you were a poor person in a small town earlier, you anyway did not have access to healthcare, and you anyway did not have like a good hospital to go to. But what COVID really showed, the middle class and above in India, is that even if you do have money in a place like Delhi, you might not get oxygen. Even if you do have money in a place like Delhi, you might not get a hospital bed, and no amount of jugaad or no amount of connections and no amount of money could really, get you that. So it really, was in many ways like a kind of a slap on the face for, the upper middle class and above in India, who can even afford to work from home and can, afford to isolate in their rooms. But for most other people, everyone lives in one room. If there is that room that exists, or nobody really has the option to work from home, nobody can, remote work and things like that. So for those people, life is the same, but unfortunately life is also not the same, because things have gotten worse. And before COVID, in 2019, we saw, the business standard reporting of the economic survey that found that youth unemployment had reached a 45-year high. I don't know if you guys remember this. The story came out in January 2019. It was the NSSO survey, which the government then denied. But then in May they said that number is actually true, and that was before COVID. So just imagine what it's like today after COVID, because things have only gotten worse. And again, this is all anecdotal evidence. We don't have a lot of data on this, but I was reading reports of bank managers and restaurant managers who were laid off during the pandemic and then were doing Manrega work. They had become manual laborers during Manrega because they needed the money to survive. And all of this, in Delhi, I remember last year there was an incident where a drunk cop had, killed like a Zomato driver. Like the cop was his shift was over and he was drunk and he hit a Zomato driver and killed him. But it turns out that Zomato driver had actually been like he was a hotel management graduate who before the pandemic was actually a restaurant manager at a 4 or 5 star hotel somewhere. Now, I think my details are not exactly 100% clear, but that's the broader story. And the only reason that that man was now driving for Zomato is because he lost his hospitality job that he had before the pandemic. And so for a vast majority of the non-laptop class who could not afford to telework or work remotely or isolate, life has been much of the same, if not worse than earlier. And for a lot of those people, it's just been one of many other things that they've just had to deal with. And so, yeah, COVID has really been more of an issue for, the middle class and above in India and even in other parts of the world, even in the United States, for example. If you drive a bus or if you work in a grocery store, you can't afford to, work from home. You have to come in and work. And for a lot of those people as well, infection rates and mortality rates have been highest among, the working class than they have, for people who could, not have to put themselves outside of the house.
Vivan, your chapter on education, I think spoke the most to me. And I think I'll come back to that in greater detail later. But, there's another chapter on social media. And, you mentioned how it's democratized the world. And we all know that we've seen its impact in the last decade. Do you think social media and education can be brought together to make a difference? And not just online education, because we've seen a lot of online education in the last 2-3 years, and I'm sure our students here will also.
You mean you don't like Byju's? You don't want to see more of Byju's?
No, we don't like Zoom either, I'm sure, and we have a lot of students here who will vouch for that fact.
No, that's a really interesting question, and I get what you're saying. I love the fact that now in the US and in India as well, you're increasingly seeing lots of alternatives to the traditional university model. And I know I'm speaking at a traditional university, and I think Ahmedabad University has done an amazing job in creating this world-class institution. But what I'm trying to say is, for a lot of people, I think too many people around the world are going through this 3 or 4 year educational program when they don't necessarily need to. And by that, what I mean is, like, we know that we need more developers and we need more coders. But is it really necessary for those people to, why does a developer need to start at 19 or at 18? Why can't someone who was previously working, someone who is digitally literate, or if maybe does not even need to be digitally literate, say who's 30, 35, or even 40, why can't they take a really intensive course in Python and become a Python developer? And if that course takes 9 months, let them spend 9 months intensively, whether that's online or whether it's at a brick and mortar a room. And why can't they become a Python developer and start working on developing applications and websites on Python? And so what I really mean to say is, like, COVID showed us that and I don't think actually India did this effectively. Schools have been shut for far too long. And in the US, we know that schools that had been shut in places like California, where I live, students have lost years worth of instruction, and students are now failing at a much higher level, and they're falling behind in math and science, versus students in states that had not shut down their schools, and those kids are doing much better. And so and in India, like, we just shut like everything down. Like in Delhi, schools were shut down for nearly 2 years, and I saw some of these kids, like, they were basically not in school at all, because the teacher would just send a PDF, which on their mom and or dad's phone they would see this PDF, and then, but who explains that PDF? And many of these people's parents are not around to explain it. So I think number one, there needs to be a lot of remedial work done for younger kids in terms of what they missed out. But on the brighter side, for older generations, I think the fact that you can now deploy education through the internet more effectively should allow us to upskill people. That's the point I'm making, is that we should use the internet for upskilling more people, and for if we need a certain number of coders, if we need a certain number of accountants, if we need a certain number of whatever job description that we need to fill, can we get those people enrolled in an online course and train them online to do these jobs? So I think we should really use some creativity in that arena.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting thing, Vivan. In fact, when you mentioned that why should we should start coding at 19, I for a moment thought that you're actually on Baiju's side and saying that 8-year-old should also start.
No. I was saying older.
No,
older
yeah, I got
yeah.
that point. But you're right, and I for one, I'm one of those people who changed their career completely at a very late stage. or not so early stage in my life. So I completely agree with you that reskilling is something, and I think internet, like you said, is everything is just on our fingertips, right? Of course there's YouTube and all, but there are also better courses from great universities that are right there for you to go through. So yeah, I think that's a brilliant suggestion.
And in my book, if you don't mind me,
Yeah.
sharing one of the stories, in my book, I actually share a story of a woman I met in Hyderabad, Nazneen. Her name has been changed, but Nazneen is basically like this domestic abuse survivor who, she was in an abusive marriage in Qatar, and she fled. And she left that marriage and went back home to Hyderabad where she was pregnant. And imagine that 20 years ago, this story, you might have seen this woman stay on in that marriage, and I know that still happens today as well, but the fact that she was able to do it is a unique thing. And so she fled her marriage and she comes back home to Hyderabad, and she starts watching these YouTube videos, which are basically makeup tutorials. And she gets really into these makeup tutorials, and she realizes, well, now I'm good at applying makeup. So she starts just practicing on girls in her neighborhood. And then eventually people tell her, oh my God, you're really good at this, you should do this for money. So then she starts charging people money in her parents' bedroom. And eventually she learns more skills on the internet. She learns how to thread eyebrows, she learns how to cut hair, she learns how to do nails. And then she hires another girl, and eventually demand is so high, she opens her own salon in Hyderabad. And just imagine that, like, this woman who's learned everything on the internet has now become an entrepreneur, opening her own salon. And that story would not have existed earlier, and the internet enabled it, and social media enabled it, because Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, they became her word of mouth and her way to get clients. And I think that's just such an incredible story on the power of the internet, in really, depending on how you use it, obviously, but the power of the internet in letting you just access whatever information you want, becoming an expert on it, and then using it to make your life better. And so there's, I've shared her story in my book as, someone who really benefited from the potential and, the great advantages that the internet can offer you.
Yes, I remember that story. It was a very heartfelt story. In fact, I think I'm sure all of us here know somebody who's know an influencer who um, wasn't that big, maybe 3 years ago or 4 years ago, and suddenly influencer marketing is like the next big thing. And in terms of skills, also these are skills that you're like, my parents would have called these skills not useful, right? They would have said that no, you better study what is this makeup, or what is this dressing up and all of that. But yeah, I think I think. Uh, Today's generation is doing jobs that we couldn't have thought of 20 years ago, and it's all thanks to social media.
Absolutely. And I think there's also obviously an underside to all of this with, with some of the scams that take place, and the things like that. But at the end of the day, like, before TikTok got banned, and I think the ban is actually a good thing, because we don't know what its parents company is doing with its data, and and all of that. But before TikTok got banned, the number, the top influencers globally, the top TikTok creators globally were all from India, and they were all from minority or marginalized communities, and they were making a lot of money by dancing and by sharing funny videos. And I think that's what really, it imagine those people having this kind of opportunity earlier. And just because of my work, I follow quite a few small town influencers on Instagram, just to stay current and updated with what's going on. And I'll follow people with hundreds and thousands, if not millions, of followers, who are posting dance videos and voiceover videos from like villages and fields and small towns. And imagine those like that demographic being so connected to the rest of the world 20 years ago. That was impossible, because the way information flowed is that it came top down. So it came from the radio, it came from a newspaper, as opposed to, going from the bottom up, where today anyone can become a creator. And in places like India, that's even more powerful because so many people have been, left out because of their geography or because of the economic circumstances.
Yeah. So Vivan, in the book, while doing the research, do you think, did you also, were you able to capture the differences between the thought processes of men, women, so basically the entire gender spectrum? Because it wasn't very clear from the book, and I'm sure you interviewed a lot, many people, but you could only mention a few in the book. So yeah.
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 No, one of the things when people do research in India, and this is whether you're a man or a woman asking questions, is oftentimes it's actually difficult to interview women. And so just imagine that, like imagine me, 3 years ago going to a small town. And just to answer one of the questions, I think Devi Prasad asked a question about small towns. I just want to say that my book and most of my research has been in small town India. And so I almost, did not speak to people in Delhi or Mumbai, but I would speak to people on the outskirts of Delhi and the outskirts of Mumbai. So example, when I went to Mumbai, I went to Kalyan, which is, about an hour and a half away on the local, as opposed to, actually Mumbai. But most of my, interviews have been in small towns like Bhopal, Indore, Cochin, Calicut, Mysore, Warangal, and places like that. So just, do want to mention that because it came up in one of the questions or the comments. Now, going back to what we were talking about earlier is regardless of whether you're a man or a woman asking these questions, talking to women in small town India can be challenging because people, it's often, when you've come in to ask, sometimes personal questions about the way people spend their money, about what they're looking for in life, you have to establish that sense of trust. And, for many women, that trust does not exist. And of course, I understand why it does not exist with men and even for a lot of women. So I've spoken to, user researchers and market researchers at big tech companies who are women who often tell me, yeah, it's very difficult for us also to talk to women when we do our field work because there's that lack of trust of it doesn't exist, and why should I share these these details with you. So I think I mentioned this in the book as well, is that I did end up speaking to more men than women, but I did make an effort to talk to as many women as possible. So my book is not academic; it's a nonfiction book. So there's not been, peer review, or there has not been like a research process that's been scrutinized by, a panel or a faculty, and or an institutional review board or anything like that. But I have made a concerted effort to talk to as many women and also people from minority and marginalized, or underrepresented communities as well. So I would actively go and seek out some of these individuals to, survey them and ask them questions so that I could include them in my book.
And did you think that something stood out in terms of, again, the thought processes, even if it was a very small set of people you met?
I did notice that, for a lot of women who are, and I share some of these stories in my book, is that a lot of, young Indians today are very outwardly cosmopolitan and are very outwardly modern. So people will wear, Western clothes, and they'll watch Netflix and they listen to Drake. But back at home, they want the traditional gender roles, and they want the traditional, and maybe even more traditional than earlier generations. And they want, everything to work in a certain hierarchy, and they want everything, men should do this and women should do that. And, what's the problem if, if you work and you also cook and you also clean, like why should I have to do any of that? So I have noticed that that has been a difference even today between men and women, and this sort of cuts across socioeconomic, bubbles in India, that you see this, with every demographic group, and so that hasn't changed a whole lot.
Okay. I think as a maybe because like you said, we live in our own bubble. This sort of comes as a shock. Even while I was reading your book, the traditional bit about the millennials really came as a shock. But yeah, I think we'll come back to that.
If I can
Um,
share one of those stories,
yeah,
because I think stories are so much more insightful. But there's someone in my book who I write about where both she and her husband, they have good paying jobs. They both work in the services sector, IT, I think, if I remember correctly. And but she was telling me, almost crying, and she was telling me that, I wake up at 5:30 so that I cook for him and I cook for, everyone at home. Then I go to work, but then we both come back from work at the same time and we both make, a similar amount of money. And he goes and lies on the bed and watches Netflix while I'm in the kitchen making food for everyone once again. And she says, I don't even mind doing it, but I hate being taken for granted. And I hate it just being expected of me. There's no thank yous. And it's just expected, like, oh, obviously you're going to do that. And she's like, what's so obvious about that? We both, make the same amount of money. We both have jobs. Why am I doing so much more extra work, unpaid work, while, he doesn't have to do it? And so and this is a person who, travels abroad, lives in Jaipur, which is not a big city, but, is a thriving, city in India. They consume, lots of goods and services, but, that traditional, way, way of operating, continues in many ways.
yeah. uh, Vivan, over the last decade, we've seen a shift towards a typical white male majoritarian view, or the upper caste Hindu view in the major economies of the world. How do you think we'll ever cover up the ground, or do you think we'll not be able to cover up this ground? I sort of feel that we've gone back 50 years, with all of this.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. But I think is at the end of the day, and I write this in my book, is that people from underrepresented communities are sharing their stories no matter what. And so in my book, I write about a Dalit rapper named Sumit Samos. And I first met Sumit, in 2019. I was invited to do a show on, Barkha Dutt's channel. There was like this channel, I think it was called Tiranga TV or something like that, which does not exist anymore. But she had invited, a bunch of people to talk about the youth vote in 2019. And Sumit had been invited to, rap because he was a rapper. And Sumit's story is so interesting. Is he's a Dalit man from Orissa, from Koraput, Orissa, which is a small town, and he joined JNU. And in JNU, he wanted to join campus politics, but he found these, left-wing groups, these communist groups, which were led by upper caste students, that told him to just stick posters on the walls. And he, refused to do that. He said, why should I be the one, sticking these posters on the walls? So he essentially started rapping, and he started uploading these videos on YouTube. And then in 2016, when, the Rohit Vemula suicide happened in Hyderabad, one of his videos went viral. And I think like Sumit got like more than 50 or 60,000 views on it. And since then, he became a celebrity, like an internet celebrity. And so he was obviously invited to perform on Barkha's show, but he was also invited to perform in all across India, in Paris and in Mauritius, and, really all across the world. And today, Sumit is actually at Oxford because he got admitted to a master's program over there, but he didn't get a scholarship. So he went onto the internet and he started a GoFundMe fundraiser to raise money to go and study at Oxford. And what the reason I share his story is, he is someone who has created this life for himself outside of, taking permission from anyone. And he said, I'm going to do this anyway. I'm going to share my view. And you're seeing that with a lot of people, that the internet and technology have enabled them to share their stories with the world, and to break out of the traditional ways of success and the traditional paths of success and doing things, and just finding it on their own in these other ways and methods.
Yeah. So Vivan, in the interest of time, I'm going to now skip through some questions and go directly to our, discussion around post-millennials. So for everyone here, post-millennials is the generation right after millennials. So people born between 1997 to 2012 are called post-millennials, which are essentially all our students. So Vivan, do you see a vast difference between millennials and post-millennials?
I do. I actually do. Because and some people call them Gen Z. And the reason why I do is because, even people born in like 1994, 1990, between 1990 and 1996, like myself, I'm not going to tell you what exact year in that age range I was born in, that range I was born in, but uh, the internet was not so ubiquitous for us either. And I remember, trying to connect to the internet in the 2000s. On Microsoft, there would be that icon of a laptop or a computer connecting to a globe and then connecting back to your laptop. And oftentimes there'd be the red, X when your connection didn't work. And most computers had a wire, a dial-up wire, that MTNL or BSNL or one of those providers would send to you, or would have to install for you. And today, I don't think anyone's ever seen that, right? Any young person today has never had that experience. India also has the cheapest mobile data in the world. Like, I often tell people in America, like, you're overpaying, for a far inferior service, because data over here is actually really bad and it's really expensive. So you can be in a big city and still not get very good data, while in India, you can practically do anything on, 4G, 5, I don't know if 5G is out yet, but on 4G. And it's so cheap and it's so fast and it's so reliable. And the reason I'm talking so much about the internet is because the post-millennial generation has grown up with the internet. So when I was coming of age, Facebook was like quite quite ubiquitous, and people would write on each other's walls and actually post photos. I mean, today nobody in my generation uses Facebook anymore, but Instagram was sort of becoming the next big thing. But no one was still wired, and nobody was still the pervasiveness of Instagram and these Snapchat was not as widespread. Meanwhile, today, young people, that's like the only thing they know. Like, anything happens, they have to go and put it on Instagram. And I think that has fundamentally affected this generation very, profoundly, in how they interact with each other and how they interact with the world. And I think it's created a lot of anxiety among young people today, is that, like, oh, I have to upload something on Instagram, and like, did it get these many likes? And if it didn't get these many likes, kids are DMing each other, like my picture or comment on it. And I think the way that makes you see yourself, and the way it makes you see the world, is quite depressing, to be honest. And I don't think it's so that's obviously the big picture, like, in terms of like the internet. But the second profound thing is that 20 years ago, millennials and younger Indians and adults had very few choices, or 30 years ago. So there were fewer brands of goods to buy. There were fewer television channels. I remember growing up, there used to be Star Plus and Z and Star World and Z Cafe. So those Hindi channels, and there were maybe a few others. And then, like, there were only two English channels, Z Cafe and Star World. But today there's like countless just on Tata Sky, but then there's also Netflix and Prime Video and, you know, all of these other providers that have now come up. And the choices that are available are, for entertainment and for opportunity are far more, in number. But again, the fact that, incomes have not risen in tandem with some of these choices is a big thing that even post millennials are unfortunately going to face at some point. Now the oldest post millennials are entering the economy, they're entering the workforce, and I don't think a lot has changed for them either when it comes to employment.
Vivaan, your description of your life makes me feel that you and I are two different generations. Because when we were growing up, there were internet cafes. We didn't have computers at home, and it was, and we had only two channels, DD1 and DD2. So that was.
Yeah.
So I think even you and I are, even though we are millennials, we are two completely different generations. And on that, I thought I'll
But for
mention.
the record, I have been to Wi-Fi cafes. I know, I know that they used to exist. So I am aware of that, but I didn't know that, it was just DD1 and DD2. That is
Yes,
news to
when we
me.
were when we were in school, and I don't want to disclose my age here right now, but yeah, okay. So now that you mention it, I really want to, so my 7-year-old has never seen a regular watch. So so she cannot wrap her mind around the fact that you don't have to charge your watch. She's never seen a
Yeah,
non-charge, and that's such a
yeah,
thing,
yeah,
because we all grew up. I mean, I only started wearing a smartwatch like 3 years ago or 4 years ago. So yeah, so that's something, you can see the generation difference with that.
yeah. Although you can show her recording of this video once we're done. But yeah, that's absolutely true. Like
Yeah,
most young people, like most kids today, have probably not even seen a landline.
yeah, yeah,
And I mean, I grew up on that. And like today, like 20, 30 years ago, if you had a relative living outside of India, you maybe spoke to them once every month or once every week or once every 6 months. Today, you can just WhatsApp call anyone whenever you want. You can WhatsApp voice call, video call, you can call on Instagram, Facebook, whatever medium for free. So, I think, like in that sense, like young people have so much more going for them than we did. But I also wouldn't want any of the, I think overall some of the negative aspects of social media are really profound, which I don't think I would have wanted to grown up with. Like I don't know how many young kids today just go out and play, without their phones. And I think that's really a tragedy.
yeah. So also, coming back to your chapter on education, Vivan, frankly, the state of education, as you mentioned in the book, hasn't improved drastically for post millennials. In fact, I would go out on a limb here and say, and I'm not talking about my university here, but most, when I see my daughter's school or other places, they've not really updated their teaching material as well. So, what we studied, post millennials are actually sort of studying the same bit. And the education system also still works towards filtering students as against educating them. And whether it is K-12 or it is university education, I feel that it needs a lot of reform. So what are your thoughts on this?
No, absolutely. That's something I read in my book is that we don't have an education system. We have a filtering system where we're not educating kids, but we're filtering them towards a small number of IITs or IIMs or AIMS, or whatever medical colleges. But at the end of the day, what are we teaching them? Are we teaching them with the skills that they can go and use anywhere? No, we're not, because everything exists on this coaching center model that you're not going to learn anything in school, so you need to go to a coaching center. And now coaching centers exist at every price range, so you can find a coaching center for 1,500, 15,000, probably even 15 lakhs. It wouldn't surprise me if those exist either. But that's like the real problem over here, is that instead of expanding opportunity, we've just expanded education. And the biggest business in India right now is education. Almost every politician, regardless of their party, has some type of, college or university that they own. And so, number one, it's a land business, right? Because like these places physically occupy a lot of land. But number two, it's like you're always going to make money, because there's always people willing to, sell off their land or sell off their assets in the hopes that their kids can have a better life. And so I've met a lot of people, particularly in Madhya Pradesh and Andhra Pradesh, where people have taken loans, where people have sold, family property that's been in their families for generations, so that their kid can get like a better education, or like, can get into an IIT or something. But the thing is that the good IITs have not increased in number. And so everyone else, is just spending time at these coaching institutions, but not really able to get anywhere. And the thing is that even these coaching centers are, they're just centers of profit. And when you're making profit, like you're either, how do you make profit, right? Your revenues have to exceed your costs. So you're either taking money from people and not providing them a good product. I mean, that's the only way that kind of this happens. Not that profit is bad. Profit is, how the world works. But when you do profit in education, is that, if someone gives you 100 rupees to make a profit, you can't give them 100 back. You're probably giving them 90 or 80 back. And in most cases, when it comes to education, probably giving them 15 or 20 back. And so the way you save money, you can't save that much money on your fixed costs, which is your physical infrastructure, right? Because buildings cost the same, security costs the same, water, electricity costs the same. So where do you save money? You save money on your teachers. And in some coaching centers, and I write about this in the book, in Indore, for example, I met an instructor at an engineering coaching center who was actually an engineering dropout. And just, think about that for a second. Like, imagine an engineering dropout is teaching kids how to get into engineering colleges at an engineering coaching center. I mean, how preposterous is that? And, Indore, for example, is a city I've spent a lot of time in, and it's booming. But the biggest industry in Indore today is the education industry. And no matter where you go, you're seeing advertisements for hostels and canteens and for education centers. But at the end of the day, have the opportunities kept up with the number of seats? And no, they haven't. And so at the end of the day, this really is a business that serves to filter people from one aspiration to the next without really delivering on the promise of that education.
Yeah. Yes. So Vivan, again, while going through your book, it came to me as a bit of a shock that the number one career goal for millennials is government job, because again, maybe we live in an echo chamber, and for us, that's not the goal, right? So, and even for post millennials, and I'm only, for me, it probably is an anecdotal data because I only look at our students. Almost everyone talks about starting up or entrepreneurship as the number one goal. So do you think, is that telling of the entire generation across the world, or is this something unique to India, or maybe we are mistaken? And like I said, it's an anecdotal thing, and maybe, post millennials are also looking at some other career goals.
Well, the data is interesting because 64% say a government job is their top priority. And then the second one is actually starting my own business.
Yes.
So it's not even private sector. So starting my own business, 19%, and then 7% is being in the private sector. If you were to do that exact same question in the US, for example, I would say being in the private sector is like 70%. Starting my own business is 25%. And not doing anything is 5%, or working for the government. Now, the reason I think in India, like people, there's that section of your students who I'm assuming don't really want to join the government, but they don't really want to, work at a call center either, or, at a BPO naturally. And so a lot of, those, a lot of people associate the private sector with being very exploitative, and with being, this place where I'm going to work at a BP or at a call center, and my shift is going to start at 9 p.m. and I'm going to get back home at 9 a.m. the next morning, and people think that that is the private sector. And other people think the private sector is extremely unstable and I could lose my job at any time. And then other people have that whole, Malik Noker dynamic that, why should I work for someone else? I don't want to be anyone's, I don't want someone to be my Malik or anything like that. I would assume that the students you're telling me about, they kind of want to start their own, Instagram businesses, or, their own startups based on, what they've seen online and, what people in other countries are doing. I think even this is a really interesting question, because even in the US, a lot of people who have like good private sector jobs are beginning to realize like, hey, if I really want, that $5 million house, I'm not going to get it by even working at like a Deloitte or a BCG. I'm going to get it by, starting my own thing. And I think a lot of people are now beginning to see that the only way for me to actually access that next level is by being my own boss. So I think that is actually a very millennial thing that you're seeing around the world. And it's even a post-millennial thing, is that risk appetite, that like, oh, if I really want to make something of myself, I'm going to have to be very risky and actually just work for myself and do it, because in the traditional setting, someone else will take the profit and I will just be the worker.
Yeah. Do we have time, Sudhir, or should we now
If
open
you
for?
have one question, otherwise I have a long list. So
I know. Okay, so I'm going to quickly ask the last question, Vivan. Again, it came to me as quite a bit of a shock when you said that the millennials, you described the Indian middle class as aspiring, upwardly mobile, yet traditional. And, like I said, it came to me as a bit of a surprise. But do you think that we are seeing a shift with the post millennials in this description?
I haven't done a whole lot of survey with post millennials, so I don't think I can answer that very effectively. Um, I think so, a little bit, in that, um, I mean, I'm just guessing, so I don't have any real, data or even stories to tell you. So I don't want to give your, viewers, the wrong impression. But I think that, even among millennials, like, yes, people are traditional, but they're not as traditional as their grandparents were, you know? So with post millennials, like, even if, this generation is traditional compared to their peers globally, they are not going to be as traditional as their grandparents, who are the parents of millennials. So I don't think that that on an absolute sense that trend would exist, but comparatively, probably yes.
Okay. Thank you so much, Vivan. Over to you, Sudhir.
yeah, thank you so much. That was
Thanks,
really
Juhi. I mean, thank you for, reading my book and asking those, questions. I think, we need to be talking about these much more. And so I'm glad we were able to have this conversation.
There's so many more questions, Vivan, that I
I
want to
know.
ask you, but I'm going to take that offline maybe later.
And I have so many to ask you. So yeah, we should take it offline.
Yes. Okay.
so. Now I would like to invite people to come on camera and ask their questions. So first, I would like to invite Dr. Nandini Kannan to ask a question. Dr. Nandini, if you can, thank you.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. Good morning, Vivan. How are you doing?
Good morning. Yes, it's
Thank
very
you.
early here, but I'm doing well. It's been great
Thank you
to
so
join this
much.
discussion.
It was so wonderful hearing you. I've been dreaming of the demographic dividend for the last 20 years now. And it's such a joy hearing someone talk about the millennials and the post millennials. I've been having this question in my mind. I've worked a lot in the area of skill development, employability, and also with the government of Gujarat on projects to get the youth to become employable and things like that. One thing that has been gnawing me from within, or something that's bothering me a lot, is that like the telecom sector has been able to capture a whole lot of people, even in the informal sector, the sabzi walas, the pan walas, and everybody practically using mobiles and social media. Don't you think we in the education sector have been failing in some way to integrate ICT-based education into the mainstream? Considering that, notwithstanding Juhi's point of liking the offline alone, but I personally feel that the online or the blended mode is extremely scalable and cost effective and probably the way to go. I think considering the kind of population that we are dealing with in our country, it's one of the best things to happen. So if the problem is more with the way we are using it, or probably we're not using it, our inability to adapt to the best blend is something where we're missing a point. So this is my perception. I'd like to know what you think of it. And as someone who's been ideating on this or has been working a lot on this, don't you think that the technology, the ICT platforms can be used in a huge way to look after education needs, skilling needs of both the formal and the informal sector in the country, in a country like ours? What do you think of it?
No, I absolutely agree with you. Thank you so much for your question. I think we have definitely failed at creatively using ICTs in innovating on education. So I'm in complete agreement with you on that. I don't know, but I don't know of anyone who has figured it out. So I do know that in the US, there's a startup. It used to be called Lambda School, and now it's called Bloom Tech. And in India, you have a similar counterpart where I know some people, it's called Masai School. And what these people essentially are doing is they are online academies for people to basically become coders slash developers. And essentially you don't pay anything. So it's almost a 3-year education that you're not paying for, but it works on an income sharing agreement. So if you get a job afterwards that pays you, like, for example, I don't know what the number is, but it pays you more than 10 lakhs a year, then the provider of that education will take a certain percentage from that, like 10%, 15%, which is only contingent on the fact that you've made that money. So I actually think that's amazing because it's not exploitative. You're not paying anything upfront. And if you get a good job, then they're taking, 10 or 15 or whatever percent, because they've provided you with the tools that you needed to get that job. So I think it's real creativity in the revenue model because it kind of breaks the traditional revenue model we've seen in Indian education of private Indian education. But then also, I know Masai School is doing really interesting things. Like in many ways, they're actually paying people. They're giving students a stipend while they're enrolled in their program. So they're not even, they're not taking money, they're giving them money. But your original question on the actual deployment of that education, why can't we innovate on deploying education more effectively on ICTs? I think that's a great one, but I don't know anyone who's really figured it out. Because, if someone had, I feel like we would have, been inspired by them and tried that in India. My biggest sort of, disappointment has been, we have all of these engineers and all of that in India, and we haven't been, able to innovate. But it's just the absolute lack of creativity that we've seen where when schools were shut, they just sent PDFs, like, here's the PDF. And, what are kids supposed to do with that? What if someone like, especially if you come from a low income household where your parents are not educated, there's nobody there to explain it to you. So I think we really did fail, particularly the pandemic exposed our failures even more so around innovating education, orienting it towards ICTs. And I hope, someone or, you've probably done more research on this, that there is some development because I don't know of, a whole lot going on.
Yeah, if I may just add one point to what we were discussing, I was just thinking futuristically and very optimistically. I'm thinking of a time that we are able to see there are a whole lot of programs that the government has devised. We have the whole Skill India movement happening, the NSDC, the Sector Skills Council, and all of that. Suppose we come up with a lot of courses and make all of these easily available, very easy for anybody who's not even educated to choose any profession or vocation he wants or she wants in whichever language that they want. And then it becomes a very scalable model where economies work out and it becomes as cheap as your mobile has come to now, no cost at all, the messages and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think then
Possible.
also tying
Futuristic,
that in,
maybe 5 years down the line.
yeah, but then
years.
also tying that in with actual jobs. Like, hey, this job is open and you need to do ABC course to get this job. But there needs to be some incentive, otherwise, why will people take this course online? Like on Coursera and edX and all of that, there's plenty of courses out there, but people are only going to take them if they feel that it's going to help them in their career, or if it will help them get a career. But unless we do that, unless there's more, and I think this is where when I was in India last, I was working on a project to help companies use their CSR funding to start apprenticeship programs, because otherwise CSR money is used on absolutely pointless things, right? Like some, award show,
That's
or
right.
some, sponsorship of, Diwali Mela,
Mm.
as opposed to, really using it to help people. So why can't we use CSR funding to sponsor apprenticeship programs for youth? And so if we can, think like that, like, really coming together, and Gujarat has so much industry, right? Like there's, or it's supposed to have a lot of industry. So, collaborating with the employment creators and saying like, let's get these many people from these courses in outside of, the traditional modes of success, it's going to create that ripple effect. Like, just to go on for a little bit further, one of the things I encountered while I was researching my book, and many people told me about, is that at certain IITs like IIT Delhi, IIT Bombay, oftentimes you'll see a bunch of students all from the exact same village. And it might be a tiny village in Tamil Nadu, or it might be a tiny village, in Bihar. Because what happened is many years ago, one student got in, and then everyone saw that one student, and they all got essentially replicated that one student's success and also became successful. Now I know I'm, adding a little bit of extra detail to the story, and it might not be entirely accurate, but what I mean to say is that when people see that one person has become successful, that creates a ripple effect with others also, willing to take that risk.
Wonderful. That's great. So I think we must get cracking on some project, and I'd like to offer that to you. We
Yes.
should do it together. I just want to add one small thing. Gujarat, as you said, is very progressive. I'm sure all of you here would know, but this is possibly the only state which has a government body called Gujarat CSR Authority, which is formed precisely to mobilize all the CSR funds and channelize them.
Yes, exactly. That's what we need to be doing more.
So we have a plan here.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Now I would like to invite Devi Prasad. He has a couple of more interesting questions. So Devi, if you can switch on your camera and audio. If you can switch on your,
Dr. Sudhir, sorry, I cannot come on.
No problem, no problem.
But I have already asked my question to Vivan, in the sense that there is a difference in the current millennials compared to the earlier cohorts, that this group, the current group, has become more materialistic. I'm not finding it wrong, but they are more concerned with the materialistic things, their living, their how to get a good job, rather than driven by any other kind of an ideology, whether it is social service ideology or any other kind of ideology. So the ideological content in the aspirational space of the millennials, I think, is not only have not only declined, but I think totally absent. So what is Vivan's comments on this? What is his observation? I would like to know. Am I clear?
I can hear you. Thanks for that question.
Thank you.
But I think ideology, is a bit of a luxury to have when, you don't have, a job, or, when you're not able to clothe yourself, or when you're not able to, feed yourself. And I'm not talking about, absolute basic essentials, but I'm saying, at the end of the day, people who've grown up with a certain level of aspiration, they also want to, be able to meet those aspirations. So I don't know whether, ideology would necessarily drive people as much as the fact that, I need a job that helps me pay my bills. And of course, bills are all relative, because your bills can be very low or your bills can be very high based on how much you consume, like you had said, and based on what your material desires are. But I don't necessarily, I have noticed that millennials, might not have that ideology, but because I'm a millennial myself, I don't know if previous generations had it. So I don't know if, people 30 years ago who were, when 30 years ago, those who were 25, if they were driven by ideology or not. So that's not, that's something perhaps you would know, you could speak to more than me, because I wasn't able to survey those people.
Okay, thank you, Devi.
Thank you.
Now,
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Anyway.
Now I would like to invite Professor Pallavi Vyas to ask a question.
Hi, Vivan. Very thoughtful talk, and I'm really looking forward to reading your book. Being so young, you are extremely, and I think you think like an economist. I'm an economics professor at Ahmedabad University, so yeah. So, my question is like when you see all these young guys at Airtel and young women as well at Airtel and any of these electronic shops, right? You see how fast they've learned this stuff, right? So if this is completely alien to from where they came from, and they've managed to they're fixing laptops, they're fixing your phone, they've got like a solution for it. You know what I mean? And they're not engineers, right? So they've somehow been able to develop these skills. So I feel like this is low-hanging fruit for us because this is like high human capital that can learn really fast, right? So is there is there any thought on, what labor market we could match them into, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like there's so much data and there's like all this other stuff where there's high demand, right? But do we need a Python coder for every part of the process? Or can we get these young, vibrant kids to somehow get into that supply chain of coding, you know what I mean?
No, I get what you're saying. And I just, this is not super relevant, but there's this really interesting story I was reading a while ago where a lot of seniors in America, not just seniors, but people of all ages in America, have been getting scammed by young men and women in India who will, call them and they'll say like, they'll hack their computer and they'll say, oh, like, your computer has been hacked, like call this number to, figure a way out. And then you call this number and then it's someone in India, in, Maharashtra or somewhere, and they are making thousands and thousands of dollars, and it goes to your point where you see these people who are just so, thrifty and so technologically savvy. And we should find ways to capitalize on, that. And I cover this in the book a little bit as well, that entrepreneurial spirit, essentially. But again, you're the economist here, so I will. I haven't thought about the larger macroeconomic implications of this, because I think that there's all of this untapped potential, but it's untapped, right? So like what are the ways you tap into it? And again, we don't need to, these kids don't necessarily need to be at a university, or they don't need to be at a traditional program, but they're absolutely like finding a way to and the US, the US does a better job of it, like the way people can become entrepreneurs over here. You really anyone, you kind of quit your job, you get a permit in no time and you're up and running. And so I think maybe, I guess the answer lies in simplifying some of those things and helping, in cutting some of the red tape. I don't know. I haven't thought about this a whole lot, but I would assume it's, on the governmental side and, providing support to these people and, getting out of their way, provided obviously they're not scamming individuals.
Yeah. I think that this class of kids is probably not going to become entrepreneurs, right? Because they don't come with that kind of backing, right? To think of to become entrepreneurs. This is low middle class.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But what you do see is that, they're very quick and they're very quick to learn.
Yeah.
And I think, the best, at least in my world, is like if somewhere the private sector could somehow like get this entire talent pool in,
Yeah.
right? Because you want to bypass the government, right? Because I mean, asking for a government job, like you were talking about earlier, and is rational. The private sector does not pay that much. Like they are paying 10,
exactly.
12,000, 15,000 max, right? I mean, for the kids with no skills, right? So because whatever they want is completely rational in my book,
Yeah.
You know,
Exactly.
based on
Yeah.
what is available. Yeah. Okay. So anyway, just a thought. So I thought maybe since you're in
No, I
Silicon
mean,
Valley.
no, that's a great thought. And like, that's what, there's a startup in India right now. It's called Apna. Then there's another called Q Jobs. These are all in the workforce space where they're essentially they're matching labor with employers. Again, it's not really a solution to what you said, but you had said like these kids are lower middle class. They're not going to become entrepreneurs because they don't have that support. So I think what I was trying to say is like, why don't we, if we want to enable them, why don't we create that support, right? Like, why don't we create like ways for people to, and I know like literally every budget this government announces, there's always some amount of money that's allocated. Last year, I think they had like an index of like social enterprises where you can invest into social enterprises. Every year they allocate some amount of money to startups, but but actually using that money that's been allocated, because there's a decent amount of it. I think maybe we can think from start use that as a starting point.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Now I would like to invite Shalini, our MBA student. Shalini, if you can switch on your camera and audio and ask the question. Yeah, thank you. Shalini, go ahead. You are unmuted. I think there is some problem with her setting. So I would like to invite Shruti. Shruti, if you can switch on your camera and audio and ask the question. Then after that, I can invite Shalini.
Yes, sir. So happy evening, everyone. I have a couple of questions within, like, first one would be that what was the methodology used to capture as well as analyze the choices that Indian millennials make?
So you're asking the methodology I used in my book?
Yes.
Yeah, so there's two principal sources of data. The first is survey data, and that's predominantly Lokniti CSGS. So CSGS is the Center for the Study of Developing Societies. They're a Delhi-based think tank that does, very extensive surveying of elections, but also social views and societal attitudes. So they do lots of exit polls, they do pre-polls. Practically every state and general election, Lokniti has a team on the ground. But this particular survey is called the Youth Survey. They do it every 10 years. So it was done in 2007 and then in 2016. And in it, they spoke to more than 6,500 respondents, which is, a pretty robust sample spread out across India and representative of most, community groups. So that survey data forms a majority of the data in the book. And so all of the numbers are cited today, like 64%, what government jobs, that all comes from there. And then I did more than 900 interviews myself. So, for all of the stories that are in the book that, describe the data, they've all come from the interviews that I've done. And, many people say 900 is a lot. Many people say 900 is, too little. And of course, the jury is going to be out. But anyone who actually does like research, knows that it's like a very significant number. And so those are the two, sources of data I used as methodology for my book.
So, sir, after you surveyed, 900 respondents, what was the process for analysis of that data?
Yeah, to be honest with you, there was no like one process, because some of those interviews were on voice memos, some of those were on notes, some of those were on my computer. And so for me, what I really did was I went and coded them. So I used like a big Excel sheet where I went and coded all of my interviews. So like when you're interviewing like someone for 15 minutes versus an hour, you can't discuss as many things, right, with the person you're talking to for 15 minutes. So I would speak about one or maybe two issues, in that time. So what I did was like I coded my entire data set, like, okay, this is on economic aspirations. Okay, this is on social views. Okay, this is on politics. And then each of those was linked to a file. So whether it was a voice file, which I would then listen to, whether it was a written, notes document, whether it was a PDF of, notes that I'd taken, that I'd written down myself. So it, that's a great question, because the biggest headache wasn't actually coding, and it wasn't actually transcribing these responses and then finding information across them. So that's a great question. And, I think like whoever attempts a book like this in future, I'd love to kind of see how they would, capture their responses.
Yes, sir. So, my next question would be, what were the coping mechanisms millennials use to face their anxieties and fears? So, yeah.
There are no coping mechanisms. I wish there, or maybe I didn't ask enough about them, but I didn't really see a whole lot. Like people had a lot of anxiety, the folks I was meeting. And there's obviously the social network, like your friends who you talk to, but that's really it. There was nothing more than that at least I saw.
So, sir, according to you, like what changes must be made to address the anxieties of Indian millennials on individual as well as systemic levels?
Well, I think there's no greater coping mechanism than, not having that problem, right? So like if your problem is that I don't have money, then having money kind of makes your problem go away. Or if your problem is that, I'm in an abusive, relationship, then not being in an abusive relationship will make that problem go away. But if you sort of go, beyond that, I think there's like a lot of like, there's a need in India to destigmatize things like mental health and, things like that. And I know like some people are taking it, I know that, among younger people, that is more of a conversation. But, like the way some of these topics are covered by the media, I think is like really not helpful to, like the way the media sort of, cover some of these incidents is not productive.
Yeah, thank you,
Thank
Shruti.
you.
We are nearing the time, and I think we don't have time. So, if you would like to take one last question, Vivan, is that okay?
Yes, of course.
Okay. So, Shalini, you can come on camera and ask a question. I think you are set now.
Good evening, sir. So first of all, thank you for such an enriching session. I got to learn so much about the struggles and the thought process of the Indian millennials. So when I think about Indian millennials, the first thing that comes to my mind is the concept of brain drain. So our country has been struggling with the phenomenon of brain drain for quite some time now. And sir, every year this number is increasing. So people are just fledging away to foreign countries, maybe in terms for search of better opportunities and etc. So I just wanted to know that as an Indian, when we see this brain drain happening, definitely we see it in a negative light, because no country would want their educated and skilled lot to leave their country and go to foreign country, and leading to economic loss to our nation.
Yeah.
So I wanted to learn about your views. Is this brain drain really justified in the light of increasing unemployment in our country? Because we know the unemployment rate is so high. So people are unnecessarily or maybe necessarily they are forced to look for other opportunities. So just wanted to know, should people continue to leave the country, or they should stay back and work on their skills and build something that is very own, not relying on the
Yeah.
opportunities and looking for employment opportunities as such?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And it's something I've thought about quite a lot. Because at the end of the day, like when an IIT engineer leaves India, that's, that's public education that governments have, invested in this system. And then that person is, going abroad. But at the end of the day, it's a free world, and people are going to go where their labor is valued, at a rate that they think it should be valued at. So for a long time, and it does not exist at that rate anymore today, but for a long time, like an IIT engineer, if they stayed on in India, was making a fraction of what their, peers who left India were making in, the US. And so people said, why am I over here making a fraction of what my classmate is making at Facebook or Microsoft or Google or Oracle? Right? Why should I be here? But now, number one, and I think the only way you fix that is by economic incentives. So, number one, companies in India, tech companies are actually paying much, much more for engineers and for developers. So, people are staying back more. But you're also now slowly seeing a reverse brain drain where Indians who left India 10, 15 years ago are now beginning to come back, and they're working in Bangalore, and they're working in Mumbai and places like that, and Gurgaon. And they're like, well, now there's more opportunity, or there's more ways we can contribute over here, and in many ways we can even make more money over here. So I actually mentioned a startup called Apna a few minutes ago that's in the workforce development space. So the founder of that, I think, went to some college in India and then went to Stanford and worked at Apple, but then in the US, but then moved back to India and started this company that's now valued at more than $1 billion. And it's a startup, it hasn't gotten public, but he's just one example out of many others who are now, moving back to India and are, contributing. So I think, at the end of the day, like in a free world, you can't tell people like, oh, you should move back to not contribute to the brain drain. But economically, as people begin to realize like, hey, I might have more opportunity in India, that people are going to start moving back on their own. And I am seeing, like, even in Silicon Valley, like I live in San Francisco, I meet a lot of people like Indians, but also not Indians, who are, passively investing in startups in India. And they're saying, like, we might not, like, this investment might not give us money, but the next one will. And I think that there is a little bit more optimism in that people are beginning to, move back. And then there are some people who are also just staying back. But I think that's also limited to a small number of people. Like when you go to Punjab, for example, the every billboard in Amritsar is for a Canadian visa, and
Yes, sir.
and I think I read a statistic that something like 1 million Indians gave up their citizenship in the last
Yes,
couple
sir.
of I don't know, 5 years or something like that. So at the end of the day, people are going to go where they have opportunity. And another interesting thing I read was that a lot of Indians are now illegally immigrating to America. So they're flying to like Mexico, or they're flying to like, a South American country and then crossing the border. And this is not something that you saw earlier. This is, a new trend that's begun. So I think it's, you're at some levels, you're seeing people leave the country, and at others, you're seeing people come back. And it's all about economic incentives.
Thanks a lot, sir. Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you,
No,
Shalini.
thanks for your question.
Now, I request Juhi to say some closing remarks.
Thank you, Sudhir. Vivan, like I've been saying, when I was reading through your book, a lot of it was eye-opening for me. And I just quote myself because probably I've been living in an echo chamber and, with like-minded people. But, and I would urge everyone to read the book, whether you're a millennial or not a millennial, because, certain things about, and, Vivan covers a plethora of backgrounds when he's interviewing these people. So it's not just one opinion that you see. It's people across geography and economic backgrounds. So yeah, Vivan, it was really really interesting to read your book, and I hope there's a sequel coming
No,
for post
thank you so much.
Yeah.
No, thanks so much. It was great being a part of this conversation. And there's a sequel of sorts coming. So we have a paperback coming out later this year, which is going to have an updated introduction, but not really a sequel. Maybe a book on post millennials, which
That's what I was
or
suggesting.
maybe you could do that. But the paperback will be out like later this year with an updated introduction and a few other conclusions and things like that.
Great. Look forward to having that in
Yeah.
our library for our students, maybe.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, but thank you, and everyone who joined, and Sudhir, and everyone who joined and asked questions. I really enjoyed being a part of this.
Yeah. Thanks to you, Vivan, for accepting and doing this, and that too here Saturday evening for you. It is early morning, so we are grateful to everybody who joined and asked questions. And see you again soon on one of these Saturdays. So take care, everyone,
Yes.
and thanks a lot, Vivan.
Thank you, Sudhir.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye, Vivan.
Bye. Thank you.